Good morning. Today, I will be reading from the book of Jeremiah, chapter 1, verses 4 through 10. Now the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you, and before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you a prophet to the nations. Then I said, Ah, Lord God, truly I do not know how to speak, for I am only a boy. But the Lord said to me, Do not say, I am only a boy, for you shall go to all to whom I send you, and you shall speak whenever I command you. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you to deliver you, says the Lord. Then the Lord put out his hand and touched my mouth, and the Lord said to me, Now I have put my words in your mouth. See, today I appoint you over the nations and kingdoms, to pluck up and pull down, to destroy and overthrow, to build and to plant. I'll also be reading from the book of Hebrews, chapter 12, verses 18 through 29. That is, once again, the book of Hebrews, chapter 12, verses 18 through 29. You have not come to something that can be touched, a blazing fire and darkness and gloom and a tempest and a sound of a trumpet, a voice whose words made the hearers beg that not another word be spoken to them, for they could not endure the order that was given. If even an animal touches the mountain, it shall be stoned to death. Indeed, so terrifying was the sight that Moses said, I tremble with fear. But you have come to Mount Zion, and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to innumerable angels in festal gathering, and to the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, and to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. See that you do not refuse the one who is speaking. For if they did not escape when they refused the one who warned them on earth, how much less will we escape if we reject the one who warns from heaven? At that time his voice shook the earth, but now he has promised yet once more, I will shake not only the earth, but also the heavens. This phrase, yet once more, indicates the removal of what is shaken, that is, created things, so that what cannot be shaken may remain. Therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, let us show gratitude, by which we may offer to God an acceptable worship with reverence and awe, for indeed our God is a consuming fire.
Our gospel reading for this morning comes from the Gospel according to St. Luke, chapter 13, verses 10 through 17. Once again, that is Luke 13, verses 10 through 17. Now Jesus was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath. And just then there appeared a woman with a spirit that had crippled her for 18 years. She was bent over and was quite unable to stand up straight. When Jesus saw her, he called her over and said, Woman, you are set free from your ailment. When he laid his hands on her, immediately she stood up straight and began praising God. But the leader of the synagogue, indignant because Jesus had cured on the Sabbath, kept saying to the crowd, There are 6 days on which work ought to be done. Come on those days and be cured, and not on the Sabbath day. But the Lord answered him and said, You hypocrites! Does not each of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or his donkey from the manger and lead it away to give it water? And ought not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan bound for 18 long years, be set free from this bondage on the Sabbath day? When he said this, all his opponents were put to shame, and the entire crowd was rejoicing at all the wonderful things being done by him. And these for us today are the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So really quickly, let me just mention that last week I had told you I was having a hard time preparing a sermon because I started in Hebrews and then I forgot to save it. And then I wrote this great sermon out of Jeremiah 4 and realized that the reading was out of Jeremiah 1. Well, as Tim noticed, not only did I have the wrong reading, I had the wrong week. Because Jeremiah chapter 1, verses 4 through 10 is this week. So the sermon you got last week was supposed to be for last week because it was the one that actually was prescribed for last week. God has a plan, and this week we get to Jeremiah chapter 1. So several weeks ago, we prayed for Daniel Fuentes Espinal. Now, we may not have been aware of it because we didn't have his name, but we prayed. And others prayed. And Daniel, or rather, Pastor Fuentes Espinal, was the Maryland pastor that I had mentioned several weeks ago who had been detained by ICE and had been sent to a detention facility in Louisiana. He was arrested for overstaying a 6-month visitor visa, which expired 24 years ago. And his detention ended up being a very visible rallying point among his community, both the church community and his local community in Eastern Maryland, which also garnered the support of a number of local politicians. According to family accounts of his first few days of detention before he got to Louisiana, his experience included lack of sanitation facilities, inadequate food, and overcrowded housing. Louisiana was not much better. Pastor Fuentes Espinal has been released and has been returned to his family and church in Maryland. But none of that is what I want to highlight. What I want to highlight is what happened while Pastor Fuentes Espinal was in the detention center in Louisiana. His 3 weeks there, Pastor Daniel made most of his time understanding, I am now in a new parish. He said, translated from Spanish in an interview after he was released, the glory of the Lord was manifest in the place where I was detained. And for 3 weeks, God opened the door for the preaching of his word, and there were many souls who were converted to Christ. That, my beloved brothers, is the victory that we have in the Lord Jesus Christ. My brother and fellow elder in the Church of the Nazarene understood his purpose, and his circumstances with legal authorities didn't change his purpose. Something I want us to think about as we begin our journey in the prophet Jeremiah, and we're going to be parked in Jeremiah for a couple weeks. So we always start with context. What do we know about Jeremiah? We don't know much about his childhood. Scripture doesn't say. We do know more about what was going on in the world during Jeremiah's lifetime. According to other portions of the book of the prophet Jeremiah, we're able to come up with a pretty accurate timeline and place in history when and where he was called to be the prophetic voice. The opening verses help us pinpoint his call to the year 627 BC. And this helps us to paint a picture of the geopolitical events that were happening. During the year that he was called to be a prophet, the king of Assyria died, which puts that kingdom in a period of political instability. And this had a direct impact on Judah, since Judah was functionally a puppet state of Assyria, or at least from an Assyrian point of view. And it was a buffer between Assyria and the other superpower of that time, Egypt. The collapse of Assyrian stability creates uncertainty for Judah and an opportunity for Egypt to extend its borders, which incidentally it had done 20 years previous. It's almost as if border clashes in that part of the world have never stopped. Just a note. The king of Judah at this time is Josiah, who is 19 years old at the time of Jeremiah's coming or calling, and he had already been king for 11 years. Yes, this means that he was crowned the king of Judah at the ripe old age of 8. 3 years before Jeremiah's calling, when the king was 16, Josiah began to seek the God of his father David, and this begins a period of reform in Judah. The Assyrian gods' places and worship and rituals were being taken down and destroyed, and proper worship of Yahweh was being restored. So we have Jeremiah being called into being a prophet at a time of transition, a time of geopolitical instability, and you've got this mix of chaos and fear and uncertainty and hope that are all present at the same time. The death of the Assyrian king and the 3 years of reforms are giving progressive residents of Judah a glimmering hope. Safety-conscious residents were leery of changing the status quo and disrupting a way of life that had made life peaceful for 60 years since Josiah's grandfather made a political pact with Assyria. The potential collapse of Assyria was a reason for anxiety since Egypt was just next door, and there's hundreds of years of tension with Egypt. And then there's rumbling in the news about a new power-hungry nation called Babylon, and we don't know what that means or what we're going to have to contend with. All of that becomes important because this is the world that young Jeremiah faced when he was confronted with the word of the Lord. Now, again, we don't know exactly how young Jeremiah was. Commentators range from him being a young child, literally, to being a young adult in his late teens or early 20s. I kind of lean towards late teen or early 20s because that would make him a contemporary of Josiah. And we see in that relationship the type of relationship that you have in peers. And this was not just a calling to help disciple a group of Jews. He was called to be a prophet of great significance. And for a young man being confronted by God, called to such a vocation, it's not a stretch of the imagination as to why God would offer him some assurances. There's a few things I want us to see in the conversation between Jeremiah and God that Tim read for us. Some conclusions that I have drawn from the text. The first is that Jeremiah was born with a purpose. In verse 5, God tells Jeremiah that he was appointed by God to the role of prophet before he was even born. He had a place in God's dream for Judah. It wasn't something that Jeremiah had to aspire to or earn or apply for. It was part of God's picture from the start. Secondly, Jeremiah gives pushback due to some perceived deficiencies. In verse 6, Jeremiah counters with his perceived lack of public speaking skills. By the way, does this sound familiar? Because Moses said exactly the same thing when he was called to be a prophet to the Pharaoh. But God doesn't consider it to be a disqualifier. In verse 9, God himself says that he'll give Jeremiah the words. God is willing to equip and enable those that he has called. Although Jeremiah doesn't overtly say anything, we see in verse 8 that God even answers the issue of fear. For the record, if I were Jeremiah, I would be afraid too. I have been in my life taxed with things of far less consequence that have given me many sleepless nights. So I can only imagine what Jeremiah was feeling. And yet, God clearly states that he, God, will be with Jeremiah and will be in the midst of his deliverance. I think that Jeremiah needed this confrontation and encouragement to be ready to walk into God's prepared dream for him. Now, it's very easy for us to read this book and dismiss Jeremiah as being an example because, after all, he was called to be a prophet that he was always supposed to be. God made him strong just for this purpose. The problem is the text doesn't tell us that. There is a lot of humanity in Jeremiah's position. We see shades of feeling inadequate, of being unprepared, of wondering if God has the right person. Jeremiah was a very normal person, but one that God created to fulfill a specific role in the story of God's love for his people. And we have to recognize there are limits to how we draw personal application from this story. To conclude that unless we have a powerful encounter with God like Moses, Isaiah, or Jeremiah, we have no specific purpose in the world. That's kind of a wrong conclusion. To conclude that unless we have this powerful encounter with God, we aren't being shown our purpose is also wrong. Jeremiah's encounter with God was not the norm in the New Testament. So we can't impose that on us today and say it should be the norm for us. But there are principles that we see in the passage that we can adopt. This passage is consistent with the narrative that God is very intentional. From that, we can rightly conclude for us that God knew what he was doing when he dreamed us up. God didn't haphazardly create us. He didn't put us together with leftover parts on the factory floor. We were created with a dream and a purpose. Not only were you intentionally crafted, formed in the womb is the terminology the verse uses, but you were done so because you are loved, wanted, and chosen by God for a purpose. That message alone is a powerful message to our dying world. There are a lot of people that we encounter that don't think that they are loved, that don't believe that they are wanted, and can't even fathom that they were chosen by God for a purpose. I have a tendency to think that Pastor Daniel, while he was in detention, met many other people who felt this way. They felt abandoned, betrayed, confused, fearful. They had fled a country of origin to find a better family situation. Once here, they found a convoluted and ever-changing bureaucratic system. They became subject to the whims of voters and politicians, which made compliance hard, and found themselves as inmates. How could this possibly fit into the plan of a loving God? I would imagine that for many, Pastor Daniel encountered, they were doubting the decisions made and questioning their own value and worth based on how they were being treated at the moment. And they were dying inside, needing to hear of a God full of love and compassion and purpose. This passage is also consistent with the pattern that God extends the invitation to partnership, and then he equips and empowers. Our proficiency-driven culture sends the message that you can only invite the powerful and equipped. But God flips the script. Say yes to me, God says, and then I will make you ready. By the way, preparation does not consist of a magic wand and pixie dust that is suddenly sprinkled over you and everything happens. Sometimes you say yes and you enter years of preparation that go into the equipping and preparation. We just have to recognize that it flows out of a response to the invitation and isn't a requirement to the invitation. And Tim's going, thank goodness. I'm going, thank goodness that God didn't wait to invite me into his dream until I went through my ordination ceremony, because between call and ordination, there was this, tiny little 29-year gap. That's part of my story. Jeremiah, as we shall see later in the book, responded to the invitation and he went. That's the final piece of the puzzle I want us to see. Jeremiah was shown his place and had a choice. His decision was to lean into the person that God dreamed him to be and follow that purpose for which he was created. And I believe that we too have a purpose for which we were created. We were born to be loved, wanted, and chosen. Notice that in that list, that's not necessarily a to-do list. And a lot of us get hung up on the to-do list. It's like, I'm afraid to be called by God because I don't know what I'm going to have to do. What are you going to have to do? You're going to have to be loved. You're going to have to deal with being wanted. And you're going to have to deal with being chosen because the Creator has chosen you. We were created to respond to the invitation to be part of great God's story of redemption. And here's the crazy part, and I think we know it. He doesn't need us. The whole story of redemption involves a whole global cast of characters that are kind of unnecessary. But that was God's decision to use them. He wants us to be part of the project. He wants us to be on his team. He doesn't want to operate in the isolation of the Trinity. But he could. Everything that he relationally needs, he has in the relationships in the Trinity. He could very functionally save the world without interacting with the world. But that's not what he wants. He wants to interact with all of his creation. He actively wants us to be part of the mix. That's part of the dream. You were created to complete the picture, and you are part of God's declaration in Genesis when he created humanity and said, "This is very good." Wasn't just Adam and Eve. Because I believe God was looking at the purpose and creation of all of humanity and where that fit into his picture of creation. And when he saw all of Adam and Eve's descendants, he said, "This is very good." The invitation to be part of the dream is open to each and every one of us. And it starts with the invitation to be redeemed ourselves, to be reconciled with the God who creates us. It follows with the invitation to be transformed, to be renewed into the person with purpose that he originally designed. And it is finally the invitation to be active, to fulfill the role that was created for us and us for it. It is an invitation to live into our original purpose. This is an Urbana year. I know everyone's going, wow, surprise. I had no idea. Right. For those of you who are not familiar with what I am talking about, Urbana is a once every 3-year student mission conference that is sponsored by the parachurch organization I work for, InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. And the sole purpose of this conference is to be a place where college students and non-student young adults can wrestle with the question, where do I fit in God's world? I first attended Urbana as a student back in 1987. And yes, we rode dinosaurs to class. My reason for going was actually kind of funny. I wasn't planning on going. I had just transferred to Cal Poly. I had just gotten involved with InterVarsity. I was in a small group Bible study. That was fine for me. I'd heard about this conference. It's like, I don't have the money to go. Not really worried about it. Thought it might be kind of nice because Billy Graham was going to be one of the speakers, and I'd never heard Billy Graham in person. And then second week of November, and most people who are familiar with Urbana are going, second week of November? Because usually your preparations for this conference start months and months and months and months before. But second week in November, I get a phone call from my youth pastor, and he said, "So, have you heard about this Urbana conference?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I heard about it in a large group, and it'd be kind of fun. Billy Graham's going to be going, but I don't have any plans to go, and I don't necessarily have the money for it." And he said, well, the church is ready to pay half your way, but I'm booking airline tickets in 90 minutes. I need an answer in the next hour. Oh, okay. So got off the phone with him, called my parents, said, I have this opportunity. Mom said, I'll call you back. About 10 minutes later, mom calls me back and says, okay, so I talked to your grandparents, and this is what we're going to do. Between us and grandma and grandpa, we will cover the other half, and that's your Christmas present. I said, great. I will call Pastor Garth and tell him to book me a ticket. So I woke up that morning not wanting to go. By the time I went to lunch in the cafeteria, everything was paid for. It's like, okay, I'm supposed to be at this conference, but I don't know why. And one of the reasons that I didn't know why is because in all of my 20-year-old wisdom, I had my life figured out. I was going to get my business degree. Then me and my buddy, we were going to launch a commercial for-profit Christian radio station. At least I think that was that month's plan. It was either that or I was leaning into building an incubator for other entrepreneurial positions to support but here's the key point. I had already planned that I was going to make a lot of money. I'd already picked out my car. BMW 325i convertible, royal blue paint, white leather interior. I can still picture it. I knew where I was going. And then I'm at this conference. Great speakers, very challenging speakers. And you would think at a place that has powerhouse Bible teachers from around the globe, and we dug deep into the book of Jonah. If you've ever wondered why I love Jonah, we spent 4 sessions in the book of Jonah. And this conference, we were broken up. 22,000 of us were broken up into small groups of 8. If you could just imagine the logistics of having to coordinate that many small groups and train small group leaders. And in our small groups, which were in our dormitories, we wrestled with the passage. We wrestled with what we were doing. You would think it would have been on the final night when there was this great call to faith that the ceiling would have opened and the angels descended. And pivotal moment for me was in the cafeteria after lunch. Actually, in the middle of lunch. I ended up going to the conference with three other young adults from my church at the time, and the 4 of us were sitting at a table in the cafeteria, having a very unflattering conversation about our home church, saying some very not nice things about how leadership had treated the high school group, being uberly critical of the intentions and methodology of church leadership, again, in our profound 20-year-old wisdom, because we obviously knew better. And in the middle of this conversation, this guy just shows up at the end of the table, says, hey, sorry for interrupting. Couldn't help but to hear your conversation. My question is, when you get back, what are you going to do to fix it? Conversation just died. And all 4 of us are staring each other in the face. And it's like, that's the question we never wanted to be asked. We were quite happy being on the criticism committee. And can I tell you, we were good. We had the spiritual gift of nitpicking. And listen to the rest of the story. You may regret saying that too. And so we just kind of stared at each other, and it's like, okay, we've been called out on the carpet. Am I going to be like the reluctant prophet Jonah and go where I don't want to? And where I don't want to is back to the youth group that I had issues with. So, because I'm high in responsibility, if you're familiar with the Clifton Strength Finders, when we got back from the conference, and I did actually wrestle with this in my small group at the last session on the last night, and had this weird conversation in the cafeteria that I don't know what to do with it, and they all prayed that God would show me what to do with it. When I got back home, because of Polly's schedule, classes started like on January 3rd. So I get back from the conference, go right to Cal Poly, and I'm in classes. Have to schedule an appointment to meet with my youth pastor, come back home a couple weeks later on a weekend, and I'm sitting across the table with Pastor Garth. And I said, I think I'm supposed to help this summer when I'm home. I don't know, but I think I'm supposed to help. And Garth said, okay, great. You want to teach Sunday school? I don't know. You want to teach Sunday school for high school? Well, I'm in small group leader training right now. I guess I could figure that one out. So yeah, sure. Sign me up. Yay, I'm going to teach high school Sunday school. Woohoo. At the end of that summer, I couldn't picture doing anything else with my life. It's like I had suddenly discovered what I'd been created for. I had suddenly had the experience where I now knew what my passions were. And I was even willing to give up the BMW 325i convertible with royal blue paint and white leather interior. Ended up trading it for a whole string of minivans because you could transport more people in minivans. Minivan. You want a funny minivan experience? Ask Eric after church about going to Mark Camp in the Dan van. But the whole point of it is this. I was pretty sure what I was supposed to do and where I was supposed to go. But it took that moment of really being challenged by God. We, at the end of this year, will be sending 7 of our young adults to this same conference. Within the district, we are sending 36 young adults. Be praying not just for the young adults. There are 2 churches on our district that are sending at least 10 students. Pray for their pastor. Pray for what's going to happen when you have a dozen young adults who have encountered God and have a sense of God's dream for my life, and then they come back and they're ready to implement it in the church. And hopefully our churches will be beyond, that's great. We want to affirm this. You can hand out forks at the potluck. Or some other very menial task that we're notorious for giving young adults because we're not ready to really trust them. We, by the way, don't fit that mold. We have a tendency to trust our young adults very quickly. They do a whole ton around here. And not just hand out forks at the potluck. But it all goes back to what we're going to see in Jeremiah, that Jeremiah had purpose. And God didn't choose him for a hard task because he couldn't find anyone else. God created him for the task while simultaneously creating Jeremiah and saying, with these qualities, I need a task worthy of this individual. God will never place us in a place that doesn't fit how we've been made. When we find discontent, it's when we're living somebody else's dream, not when we're living God's dream. As the immigration issue continues to play out in front of us, we will find very, very passionate voices on all points of the spectrum of the debate. Let us be grateful that within our tradition, at least one man, a man of God who knew and embraced his purpose, stayed faithful to his calling, period.